My name is Crystal, and I am the host of Stories from Palestine podcast, and also a licensed tour guide by the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism. Together with my colleague Salim, we are organizing 3 10-day programs this year to discover Palestine. There is still space in the upcoming program mid-March and also in June and October. We travel around the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Jaffa with small groups, maximum 10 people. We provide historical background, we introduce you to the Palestinian heritage, and we make sure that you get to meet a lot of locals. We stay in family-run hotels, and we also spend 2 nights with Palestinian families. We do some short hikes, easy hikes, and during the October program, you can also join a day of olive harvesting. If you are interested, then check out our website for more information. I will ask Roberto if he can add a link to the show notes of the podcast, but you can also write it down. It is storiesfrompalestine.info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guests are Irfan. Anne is a lecturer in interdisciplinary race, gender, and post-colonial studies at University College London, UCL, and Jo Kelcey, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Lebanese American University. And her research explores the intersections of education, globalization, with a particular focus on education provisions for refugees. In fact, today we are going to talk about a topic which I never really touched upon in the past episodes of Jerusalem Unplugged. We're going to unpack UNRWA, or United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. UNRWA has often been described as a quasi-government or even a quasi-state for millions of Palestinian refugees across the Middle East. Active since the 1950s, and thus virtually contemporaneous with the Palestinian refugee crisis, it provides services more typically the domain of modern nation states, including a large-scale education program, healthcare, municipal service in the camps, and registration procedures. So before we delve into all of the topics we're going to talk about today, first of all, let me say, Jo and Anne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Hi, thank you.
So the first question I want to ask, if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your background, and actually how you came to work on UNRWA. So perhaps we can start with Anne.
Sure, thank you, Roberto. So in terms of my academic background, I trained as a historian. I work mostly on history of the modern Middle East, particularly the Mashriq. And how I came to UNRWA was actually not really through academia initially, but through kind of a bit of a cliche around volunteering in the West Bank. When I was a student, when I was an undergraduate, one summer I volunteered at a camp in Bethlehem at an UNRWA school teaching English, doing an English summer school with kids there. And as I say, it was at an UNRWA school, and I was spending a lot of time in the camp and seeing UNRWA installations and UNRWA signage everywhere. And I was really struck by this quite unusual and quite distinctive juxtaposition between the overt Palestinianness of the camp as a space and the presence and consciousness of the UN as an institution, which was often articulated through the specific agency of UNRWA. And then when I came to do my master's degree and I was thinking about what I wanted to focus on for my master's thesis, I decided I wanted to zoom in on that a little bit more. And from there, well, obviously we'll get to this more, I'm sure, but from there I discovered the whole complexities behind the UNRWA archive, and as a historian, that was really fascinating for me, and that basically set me off on years of digging into UNRWA, and particularly digging into the archive.
Yeah, I have a not dissimilar trajectory, I guess, into this work. I had actually been working for different aid agencies in the region. And so I was very aware of UNRWA, although I never worked for UNRWA. I worked for another UN agency and some NGOs. And UNRWA was always kind of there, and everyone said UNRWA, and it felt like a bit of a big black box, that needed to be opened up. But I knew that it was particular to the region, and then I really got very interested. I was in Lebanon in 2011, 2012. My husband's Lebanese, so spending a lot of time in Lebanon. And at that time, the conflict in Syria was starting, and what I was really noticing, so I'm thinking about embarking on my PhD, and there was this discourse happening kind of in the background talking about, but this has never happened before. The number of refugees, this is unprecedented. We have no kind of model or blueprint for how to handle this. And this was coming from Lebanese politicians. You're hearing it also from Jordanian politicians, and you were also hearing it from the aid community. And having worked in the region for quite some time, I was just really struck by the ahistoricism of all of these aid discourses and what was happening in the media. And that got me really interested in thinking about, clearly it's not the case. So what is this history? And what can it offer? Potentially not just for understanding the Palestinian question, but also what was happening in terms of Syrian refugees in the region.
Now, because we're going to talk about UNRWA, I was wondering if you can tell us in your different ways actually what UNRWA is and how it works.
Yes, that's a really, really good question. I think UNRWA is just this bundle of this huge bundle of complexities. It's, in some ways, I think the most important question to be asking is, what is UNRWA? It's certainly a question that I keep coming back to, in part because of these huge contradictions. So, as Anne touched on, it's a global agency, right? It's this UN agency, but it's also specific to Palestinians. It's set up as a temporary agency, but we're still here, nearing sort of towards 80 years. And in practice, it runs services, so it looks different than a lot of UN agencies. And in some ways, it's quite autarkic, right? Like a lot of Palestinians work for UNRWA, but it's also massively incomplete. Like it doesn't provide anything close to the kind of public services that you'd expect a government to provide. It's also rhetorically apolitical, but it functions in a very, very political way. So I feel like this question of what is UNRWA is really the one to be kind of asking, and the history is so important to understanding those contradictions. And in part, the history that it was set up to serve such a different purpose than the one it's ended up playing. And I think it really stands as this paradigm of kind of 1950s modernization policy, right? And how at the time coming out of the Second World War, the global community was thinking about aid, and in particular, the kind of economics first imperative on it.
Yeah, and I think it's worth adding as well on this point of what is UNRWA. The fact that there's lots of different elements and lots of different actors involved in how we might conceptualize or understand UNRWA as an organization. As Jo mentioned, a lot of Palestinians work for UNRWA. The vast majority of UNRWA's staff are themselves Palestinian, but at senior management level, employees are pretty much entirely Westerners, certainly from the global north. There's also the donors who fund UNRWA's work, who are, or historically have mostly been predominantly, again, Western states. There are the host states who also facilitate UNRWA's work. So there's all these different actors that make up UNRWA or that shape UNRWA's work, and they don't necessarily have exactly the same motives or exactly the same priorities or interests. So when we speak about what is UNRWA, the answer might vary depending on which of those elements we're speaking to as well.
And that brings me to the question I wanted to ask you about how Palestinians sees UNRWA and the work that is being done by UNRWA basically in the past 8 years. And perhaps, Anne, you can also tell us a little bit more about your experience since you volunteered in a camp, and see how you interacted with them, and how perhaps the younger Palestinians, since you were working in education, how they felt about the activities that were offered by UNRWA.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to speak too much to what Palestinians think about UNRWA, partly being conscious of my own positionality as a non-Palestinian, but also because I think there's often a danger in these conversations that we can risk coming away with quite an essentialized view. I think there's probably a couple of things I would flag in response to that question, and I'm sure Jo would want to add to it as well. That the first thing being that, as Jo just mentioned, a lot of UNRWA staff are themselves Palestinian. So I think viewing UNRWA and quote unquote the Palestinians as separate entities is not entirely accurate. There's a lot of overlap in those two, between those two groups, or between those two actors. That's one thing to keep in mind. And then it's also worth noting that when we speak about the Palestinians, obviously we're talking about millions of people, but we're also talking about people who may have very different relationships to UNRWA. So there are obviously Palestinians as a whole. There are also Palestinian refugees. The majority of Palestinians are refugees, but not every Palestinian is a refugee. And then within that group, there are Palestinian refugees who actually live in the areas where UNRWA operates. UNRWA only operates in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the occupied Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestine. So you could be a Palestinian refugee, say, living in Egypt or Iraq or further afield in Europe or the US, and you wouldn't be receiving any services from UNRWA, and your relationship to UNRWA is therefore likely to be quite different. And that's before we even get into the differences in how UNRWA operates, let's say, in Syria as opposed to the West Bank. So there's all these different contingencies and all these different dynamics at play in driving what is not just a singular relationship, but a set of relationships, really.
Yeah, I think I would, certainly the geographical element shapes, I think, how people view UNRWA and how they experience UNRWA, right? Because UNRWA does provide these services. And so there is much more of a kind of direct relationship, along with the number of Palestinians that are employed for UNRWA. There's this very direct relationship. Thinking about the schools, right? It's your first point of contact from a very young age with something like a state. And for Palestinians, it's the first point of contact with UNRWA, right? Which is not a state, but it's certainly, very, very important agency. I also think it's important to think about how the relationships changed over time. I don't think it's a static relationship, and so not only does it differ by region, certainly in Lebanon, right, it would differ by whether you were in Beirut versus whether you were in the south or the north, and the different experiences that come with that. But I think it has also changed a lot over time. And so, if you look at something like UNRWA during the first Intifada in the West Bank, I think that's a very, very different relationship that Palestinians had with the agency than thinking about how Palestinians in Syria experienced the agency, or Palestinians in Lebanon today, or at the same time during the 1980s, for example. It's, I also wouldn't feel comfortable talking about one kind of relationship, but I think just to add to that multiplicity of relationships, the complexity that time and space gives.
Now, before we move forward to discussing archives and other issues about UNRWA, actually I wanted to ask you something, because I'm sure that most of the listeners are familiar with the status of Palestinian refugees, but I must admit that sometimes, given that Jerusalem Unplugged is generally listened to a variety of different people, if you can give us a sense of the legal status of Palestinian refugees.
Sure. Well, this could probably be an entire podcast in itself. It depends slightly on exactly what you're referring to, but essentially, Palestinians are recognized as refugees under international law. They have, however, a slightly unusual status in terms of international conventions by virtue of the fact that they are served by UNRWA and not UNHCR, which puts them in a unique position among the world's refugees. So UNRWA was established by the UN General Assembly at the end of 1949. It began operations a few months later in 1950. And that's significant because it means that UNRWA was created and began work both before the 1951 Refugee Convention and before UNHCR came along. So it predates both of those things. And for various reasons, the decision was made that UNRWA would not be merged with UNHCR once UNHCR had arrived on the scene. So it's retained this distinctiveness. Nevertheless, Palestinians are recognized internationally as being refugees. And one thing it's probably worth flagging in view of all of the controversy and misinformation that exists about this, those Palestinians who were born in exile are also recognized as refugees. But crucially, that is not actually distinctive or unique to the Palestinians. That is a standard convention among protracted refugee situations. And we can find that with various other examples of long-term refugees as well. So that actually is not unique to the Palestinians, although you will often hear it erroneously said that it's unusual.
Yeah, and I think actually UNHCR ended up coming out a couple of years ago and making a statement along those lines to say actually, refugees in Dadaab, Kakuma, in Kenya, in Colombia, it's exactly the same, right? We're looking at multi-generational situations here. It's just what's different about the Palestinian case is that it's been so long that sort of started, that particular facet of law was perhaps more obvious sooner. I think the other thing to kind of understand the complexities around the legal situation is to know that UNRWA is part of a two-part regime. And so it was set up alongside an organization called the UN Conciliation Council for Palestine. And sort of going back to its history and the idea that UNRWA was very much founded as a job creation program to kind of find a bit of a backdoor solution to the refugee question by providing jobs and sort of assuming that this would essentially dissipate the question of the refugees. The Conciliation Council was really given the political mandate. So they sort of bifurcated this economic and this political solution, quote unquote. And the Conciliation Council was really supposed to negotiate, right, what would happen in terms of the right of return based on UN 194. And that didn't happen because the stakeholders, at the time really just didn't want to play ball with it. And so UNCCP is a big part of this question. And together, UNRWA and UNCCP should have created a much more robust regime for Palestinians. But because UNCCP doesn't really operate anymore, I think it still submits a kind of very nominal report once a year to the General Assembly or the Security Council. But because it's essentially non-operational, you have what a lot of scholars, Susan Akram in particular, has coined a protection gap, which is essentially where Palestinians are not covered by these questions of legal protections.
Because you talked about Omzul history and also the question that also Palestinians of different generations basically acquire the status of refugees, I wanted to ask you something about UNRWA in the long term. I'm not asking you about a judgment, but I was curious about your thoughts about how UNRWA changed throughout the past 80 years and how it adapted to the different times, different administrations, and also general world events, and also understanding of Palestinian refugees. And let me give you a very quick example. I remember growing up in Italy, late 70s, early 80s, and there was this strong attachment to the Palestinians, particularly with the first Intifada, and Palestinian refugees were somehow cherished, and but then from the early 2000s, it just disappeared. We had changing governments. There was the era of first Berlusconi. The country turned right. Nobody knows anything. And so I wonder also how these kind of events may change the perception and the work of UNRWA in the long run.
Yeah, I think was it Italia 86 when the World Cup was dedicated to Palestinians. Quite an important symbolic moment. Certainly I think UNRWA, that question that we've sort of posed, right? What is UNRWA? At least the one that we grapple with a lot. I think the reason that's so difficult to answer is because you have so many different kind of power constituencies operating in this sort of shell of an agency, right? So UNRWA is not at all static. It changes based on, what's happening in the donor community, what's happening with the Palestinian community. UNRWA in Lebanon in the 70s, with the PLO being as strong as it was, is a very, very different agency than UNRWA in Syria, for example, or in Jordan. And so I think, these ebbs and flows, they really are shaped by, they're certainly shaped by geopolitics, as we know now with the defunding of the agency and the way that the American government, along with others, have been, really seeking to kind of take away the resources of the agency. But they're also shaped by regional politics, hugely, politics of the host states, and by Palestinian politics. And so, UNRWA during the first Intifada, I think, and I believe that Ben Schiff talks about this in his book on UNRWA, where he talks about how the perceptions of the Palestinians in kind of Western media really shifted from what had happened in Lebanon to what was happening in the Intifada in the West Bank, how people perceived Palestinians. And that led to a huge amount of new kind of funding coming in for the agency, which obviously shaped the kind of programs that it could do and what it could do. And it's not... it's not for nothing that that's when you see UNRWA really dig down and basically try to take on a little bit more of a protection mandate, although it's certainly nothing like the level of protection that the refugees need.
Yeah, I think it's also worth flagging how UNRWA has, in addition to various sort of international stakeholders, UNRWA has also been, to some degree, maybe unintentionally, at the behest of Palestinians themselves. And as Jo mentioned, it's had to also adapt in response to changing Palestinian politics and to shifts in priorities among different Palestinian actors over the decades as well. There are many consistent threads, obviously, in terms of Palestinian politics and Palestinian priorities since the Nakba. But there have also been shifts across both time and space, and UNRWA has also had to react to those. I mean, I think one constant kind of pendulum swing that UNRWA's that's characterized UNRWA's history is this move between response to emergency and then slightly longer term work that's more akin to what you might call development work. And UNRWA has pretty much always going back between those two. And actually, I think in the last couple of years, UNRWA senior management have said that the agency is now working in a state of emergency in 4 of the 5 fields, the exception being Jordan. But in the other 4 fields, it says it considers itself to be working in a state of emergency. And so there's also this slightly strange juxtaposition, I think, in UNRWA's work, that it has an underlying attempt to do something a little bit more stable and long-term as far as a temporary agency can, but then pretty regularly it gets hit by various new crises across the fields.
Another interesting question about particularly the understanding of UNRWA and the question of Palestinian refugees is that I had the feeling that up until a few weeks ago, a lot of people never thought, at least in recent times, that actually there are Palestinian refugee camps like within Jerusalem, for instance, and it's only because events around Shuafat that then they were reported by international outlets. I mean, I remember some people saying, "Oh, are the refugee camps in Jerusalem?" Yes, there are actually geographically they are part of Jerusalem, and I thought it was very interesting that. For a brief moment, the whole question popped up again. It disappeared very quickly, but I thought it was very important to give a sense, sort of give publicity to actually those refugee camps. Let me go back to sort of the main bulk of your work, which is very much about the archives. So in recent times, scholars like yourselves, obviously, I'm thinking about Mesna Kato, Bishara Dumani, and others, have begun to pay attention to archives, not just as a source for and of history, but also in terms of social justice. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this idea to look at archives from the point of view of epistemic justice, of social justice?
Well, archives, in my view, I would say, are really inherently entangled with questions of both epistemic and social justice, because archives, by their very existence, speak to questions about whose voices are recorded, whose voices are listened to, who is represented, who is silenced, and then on the flip side, who is granted access to those voices and to those records. And these are questions that very much come to the fore when we think about UNRWA's archives, which are not only can be very difficult to access, but also quite selective in what is preserved and what is not preserved. And then what adds another layer to all of these dynamics is the fact that in the case of the Palestinians, of course, we're talking about a people who are displaced, dispossessed, and dispersed, and therefore do not have a unified, comprehensive national archive of the people themselves. And in that context, the archive of an institution like UNRWA becomes even more important, or potentially even more important.
Yeah, and I think, for me, this question of silencing is so important because of how much Palestinians have had their voices silenced, right? On the global stage, regional stage, who gets to speak. And so the question of what UNRWA's archive, who it represents, is a really important part, I think, of understanding how these silences work. Both in the kind of obvious ways, right? Who gets to have access to this archive, what's included in the archive, but also I think in some of the more kind of implicit ways in which documents are curated and they're classified. It's quite, in some ways, those dimensions of the archive tell you a little bit more than some of the materials sometimes, right? I certainly found them to be equally important in terms of interpreting what this archive and this history meant. The importance that the UN accords to particular events, I think, might be quite different than the importance that the refugees themselves accord to certain events. And those two things are not synonymous, because you often don't hear Palestinian voices in this UNRWA archive.
And that brings me to the question of sort of the material aspect of the archives. So the archives are based in Amman, even though material is scattered around. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the history of the archive itself and, the material. You mentioned accessibility, for instance, who is allowed and who's not allowed to access the material. And also perhaps at large, what exactly these archives can tell us.
Yeah, the archive is currently in Amman, but it's been moved several times. So it's been moved from, initially UNRWA was headquartered in Beirut. The archive was moved, I believe, between 75 and 78. UNRWA made the decision, a little stretched out decision. They weren't quite sure where the situation was headed. And so they ended up moving the agency to Vienna, and the archive moved with it. It also then subsequently moved to Gaza, and then the bulk of it has moved to Amman. I just want to kind of caveat this by saying, actually, I've done a lot of digging on this, and it's sometimes unclear what constitutes the archive. I mean, we're talking about the central registry here. I've heard all sorts of things from people saying that, oh no, but there are definitely archives still in Lebanon related to the country program. I've not found much evidence of this, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think this question of sort of people who's, have been dispersed and their history has been fractured is reflected in the ways that the archive has been geographically dispersed. So that sort of is the bulk of the central registry, what's happened there. But it's, the archive is also not necessarily, I don't think it's a standalone archive, right? UNRWA as an agency has had a lot of dealings with other UN agencies. And so you will also find files and documents that are directly relevant to UNRWA that are stored in other UN archives.
Yeah, and I think I would add that the organization that exists, or the lack thereof, in terms of how documents have been preserved across various UN archives, also speaks to it at least implicitly, if not explicitly, to some of these questions of epistemic justice as well, because it really can be kind of like feeling your way in the dark, trying to identify and locate certain documents and certain sources. It seems on occasion to have been quite haphazard, which, for example, there will be documents that if you try to access them in one UN archive, you'll be told, they're classified and you can't access them. But then if you try and access those exact same documents in another one, you'll be told you can take photos of them. So there's not necessarily a very coherent approach overall to the archives. And I think it's also worth adding, if we think about questions of accessibility, so as Jo said, the central registry is in Amman, which at least in theory, and I emphasize in theory, would be accessible to many Palestinians and many Arabs in the region. But let's say you need one of these documents I just mentioned that maybe is not in Amman, maybe it's at the UN headquarters archive in New York, and then you need to be able to travel to New York. And if you are on a Global South passport, that's going to be a lot more difficult. But you might be from one of the communities who actually has, arguably the greatest right to access these documents. So there are questions of accessibility, I think, both in terms of official policy and just in terms of the politics and the international dynamics of where things are located and how you can actually get to them.
I think there's also UNRWA's bureaucracy on top of that. So we actually met, we found each other because we were both trying to work in UNRWA's archive, and it's very useful to have a bit of a support system, to be really honest. It's not very transparent, at least when our experience at the time was that it was not very transparent to access the archive. Interestingly, many UNRWA staff didn't know that it existed, which I think is also kind of a really interesting and telling sign of how the agency operates. And the kind of procedures and the requirements to access it were incredibly opaque. You have to be quite determined to access it. And because there aren't sort of transparent procedures, I don't want to say on what basis it's decided, but I certainly at different points had to submit descriptions of my research to get it past different kind of approval processes. So one with the kind of department that I was interested in researching around education, another one with the Office of the Commissioner General. And the advice that I was sort of given variously by folks that had previously worked in the archive was make that description as politically innocuous as you possibly can. Yeah. And I think, that's there's a lot that you can unpack with that, but the procedures for accessing, I do consider myself extremely lucky that I was able to do that and access the funding, right, to wait around for these decisions and be able to travel like that without a visa. So there's also that dimension of the agency's own politics and bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that every time I visited the Central Registry Archive, the procedure was different. And the contact person was different. I haven't been there in a few years now. Last time I was there was before COVID, so I can't speak to the situation now, but certainly during the visits I made, there was never an archivist in post. And because of that, you would sort of just get pushed between different staff members who usually would find they'd just been assigned responsibility for the archive on top of their regular job. Which of course added to the fact that it was quite a chaotic process, and it was really not those individuals' fault at all. But it added to the opacity, to the confusion. It was things like, I think Jo had similar experiences. One time you'd be told you could take pictures, then you couldn't take pictures, but they could scan them and send them to you. Then you could take photocopies. It was always quite inconsistent, and I think a major reason for that was because there was no archivist and there was no coherent policy. And then in turn, there was a lot of nervousness around around giving access to people for fear of what they might then report, which chimes with what Jo mentioned about the suggestion to make your research sound as politically innocuous as possible.
Now, as you were talking about all of these issues, actually, I was reminded by a couple of things. One, that it's not only obviously UNRWA, but for instance, in Jerusalem, there's a famous religious institutions, and I want to mention names, but they didn't allow me because I don't belong to that in denomination to see the documents. But the ridiculous thing is that the same exact document as you mentioned then is available at the British archives, because there was an exchange of documents, and here we are. Obviously, I couldn't see maybe the notes or the rest, but it's the same issue. And as Joe, you were saying about the question of they don't understand the material they have. That reminds me again, the big question of the Jerusalem archives, for instance, which basically are sitting in this bunker beneath the Jerusalem municipality. Now they're being moved away. Nobody knows exactly where. Speculation is that somewhere in the West Bank. But they don't know exactly what they have. And, all the time I worked there and I was asking for material because there's a kind of catalog. Then the reality is that maybe in the catalog it says, yes, you have Ottoman documents. And then they gave me boxes with utility bills from the 1960s. And I wasn't sure exactly why. And again, the director, who's a very nice person, is an engineer and he doesn't know anything about archiving. So I feel like there's a trend here. I mean, it's not just UNRWA, but I think there's a general trend, possibly in the Middle East, about archiving, access, and also understanding to a point the value of that material, because we have the wrong people,
But
in the wrong job, basically.
But I think in the case of UNRWA, I mean, I can't speak to the Jerusalem archives. I haven't worked with them or attempted to work with them. But in the case of UNRWA, I would say it's actually not necessarily related to the context of the Middle East. It's the fact that essentially UNRWA has not been provided with the necessary funding that is needed, say, to hire an archivist or to put in place proper archival procedures. And I think this ultimately comes down to bigger questions around how UNRWA is funded and the problems with that entire process and what is seen as important or not important.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really speaks to a certain self-conception among UNRWA's kind of upper bureaucracy, sort of, this higher level cadre of Western decision makers, who really view the agency in terms of its kind of underlying humanitarian function, or the function that has come to dominate UNRWA, even if it wasn't its intended function. And if you're in that kind of a mentality, right, or you're thinking in that kind of way, you're addressing these crises right now more than ever, arguably. Though I'm not sure that this is the first time UNRWA has had this much of an expansive crisis. But I think, it speaks to this sense of kind of like, you make decisions, you do things, you think about the documentation for later, right? That's a longer term issue. And it's not what I think is the dominant kind of work culture in UNRWA. I think also, there are political sensitivities, right? This is an agency that day in, day out is dealing with misinterpretations, bad media, press, a lot of pressures, right, on it to, essentially intended to kind of pressure it to close or to stop functioning. And so if you don't know what's in the archive and you don't understand the value of kind of critical reflective scholarship that could be drawing out some of these historical lessons, you're going to be much less interested in opening them up to people who can do that work, right? It's both a long game and it's a risky, there's an inherent risk. And so that's not to sort of let them off the hook in any way. But I think to the extent that archive preservation is decentralized in the UN, if you're facing a massive funding crisis, unless a donor comes in and says, we're going to really pay long term for you to preserve this archive, it's going to be very hard for you to make that case internally.
And I just want to make a correction of what I said earlier, because I think I came out a little bit orientalistic in a way. I was interviewing a few people discussing archives, particularly of religious institutions or private archives. And, one thing that came out was that these archives tend to be highly protected. They don't want to share the material for good reasons sometimes, because they're afraid that they may be used against themselves. And as I was part of this large project, Open Jerusalem, this is one of the barrier that we bump into, right? Try to get the trust to get the material, put it out, contextualize it. And on the other hand, we also bump into, again, public archives that felt, run by, as I said, people who with no skills or knowledge how to run actually an archive and understanding the material, which made it the opposite in a sense, totally unreliable and uneasy to access for completely different reasons.
Yeah,
Let
and
me
I
ask you.
think, sorry to interrupt you, Roberta, but just to very quickly add, I think again, this really stems from the fact that there isn't a proper process. And because of that, there's just a concern that if you're allowed into the archive, who knows what you might stumble upon because things haven't really been organized in any kind of systemic way.
And that brings me to the next question. So, what exactly do we find in the UNRWA archives? And you, Joe, mentioned earlier silencing. So, who has a vested interest in, silencing that material?
So there's, it really depends, I think. So first of all, I can only really speak to the education files. And I think maybe something to clarify is that UNRWA decides what you get access to. So you describe your research, you send them this sort of general blurb about what you're looking at. They send you back a list. If you're lucky like us, you come across like-minded folks doing research and you say, hey, have you got the same list? Like, are there things that might be missing? If you've been able to fortunately access, for example, archives in Paris at UNESCO or New York, you might also say, actually, I know there's a little bit more to this story. So you're sent that is kind of the first port of call. So I can only really speak to what we were able to see in the central registry, which is those things that are tagged as relevant to education. And then it really depends, I think, on the period that you're talking about a little bit. So for the early years, like the 1950s, you're going to find a mass of code cables. And oftentimes you have to piece together, they split them into like incoming code cables and outgoing code cables. And so you're kind of reading across these folders to piece together, the messages. As you also get a lot of official correspondence. So that will be correspondence with other UN agencies, especially in the early years when UNRWA was less autonomous perhaps than you might think of it these days. And you'll get a lot of official correspondence to folks in UN General Assembly, for example, other UN agencies, internal communications between UNRWA's field and its headquarters, and memos and meeting notes were kind of the bulk of things. You do occasionally, at different periods of time, get different kinds of documents. So, for example, in the 1970s, UNESCO, which played a really key role in setting up UNRWA's education program, told UNRWA essentially that it had to send it regular situation reports on the situation. So for the first part of the Lebanese war until 82, you get quite quite interesting granular information on what was happening to the schools at the time, the strikes that were happening, the damage that was done to the schools. So that's kind of, I think, a lot of bureaucratic and administrative information. I'll just end by saying that the bulk of it is in English, which for an agency that's overwhelmingly staffed by Palestinians tells you quite a lot if we're going back to that question of epistemic injustice.
Yeah. And actually, just to add in terms of one piece of content that I remember finding in the archive that really speaks to that was a big issue that occurred in the late 1970s. That was a clash between some Palestinian members of staff and management when these staff protested at the UN censoring of actions by the PFLP, plane hijackings. And there were all of these communications between senior UNRWA management over how are they going to respond to all of these complaints from Palestinian members. And I remember really clearly reading one communication from the Commissioner General where he basically said, like, I've been sent 2 different translations of this letter from the Palestinian staff members. Which one is more accurate? Which really speaks to the limitations here. If you have someone running overall in charge of an agency that operates in the Arabic-speaking world, and he's essentially unable to communicate with his staff over an extremely controversial and sensitive subject because he doesn't speak the language.
Yeah, I think the other thing sort of just to your point on silencing is that sometimes the trail just goes completely cold, right? And you sort of, even if you're looking at what else is stored in Paris or in New York, it just goes completely cold. And I think it speaks to actually how a lot of UNRWA's decision making is done on the fly and is not recorded formally. One of the really interesting things for me about UNRWA is actually the extent to which it doesn't make decisions, and it really does try to step away in some ways from making decisions. Of course, it still ends up being massively consequential. But, a good example would be around curriculum policy, for example, where you hear today, this is like a real flashpoint, right? UNRWA is often severely criticized for what it's teaching in its schools and its textbooks. And the curriculum policy that's in place is that Palestinians learn the curriculum of the host states. There's no official recorded policy that sets this out. That doesn't mean that it's not become the policy, right? I mean, this has dominated the agency's education program for the better part of 80 years. But try to find the actual policy document. I mean, you might find reference to it in minutes of conferences that were held back in the 50s. And then you'll find references again with people who've got sort of an institutional memory, having been consulted when the question comes up again in the 60s. But the sense that you get is actually a lot of consequential decisions made verbally, in part because they can be very politically sensitive, or just because that's the culture of the agency. It doesn't see itself as having this long-term role, and it certainly doesn't see itself as a policymaker or engaging in planning in that way.
I have a few more questions, and one is for you, Anne. So going back to the 2017 Ibrahim Dakak Award for Outstanding Essay on Jerusalem, awarded by the Jerusalem Quarterly. So the title of your article was, "Is Jerusalem International or Palestinian? Rethinking UNGA Resolution 181." So I was wondering if you can answer that question again 5 years later, and so perhaps highlighting if anything has changed in your views.
Thank you for the question. I wouldn't say anything has changed exactly, but I think I actually reread the article this morning, having not read it in a while, because it was published in 2017. I think I actually wrote it in 2016. I think, as I say, it's not necessarily that my mind has changed, but if I were to write it again now, I would definitely dig deeper and push further on how I conceptualize the term international and what I really mean by that term. I do talk about this a little bit in the essay, but I think there's a lot more scope to talk about the fact that the term international is in many ways, inherently a flawed term, but also it's a term that can have many different meanings depending on who is invoking it. So in the context of that essay, I'm largely talking about Western and colonial powers invoking fairly limited understandings of what they call international, really as a way of preserving or furthering their own power and their own interests. But there are alternate conceptualizations of what is international and internationalization and internationalism that really speak more to solidarity across the global south, to anti-colonial movements, and those forms of internationalism have been invoked and deployed sometimes very effectively by Palestinians. So I think I would probably, were I to write the essay now, engage a little bit more with those tensions around the term international, and also maybe the question of whether international versus Palestinian is necessarily mutually exclusive is something I would explore a little bit more. In my book, which is coming out next year, I talk a lot more about these different forms of the international and the ways in which at times Palestinian activists and Palestinian nationalists have actually seen Palestinian and international as very much going hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think there's sometimes people misunderstand the term international with the idea of a cosmopolitan,
Right.
which is very problematic. I mean, Jerusalem certainly had periods of high cosmopolitanism, particularly actually under Jordanian administration. Jerusalem was extremely cosmopolitan for a lot of people traveling, but there's a tension here with the word international, and you're absolutely right there. Jo, I have a question for you. Now, you already mentioned education, which is your area of expertise. I didn't really cover much this in the podcast, and certainly in terms of refugee camps. So I was wondering if you can give us a sense of the educational system and the education provided to Palestinians in refugee camps.
Sure. Another big question. So, UNRWA's education program, I think just has this really interesting history because it's not in the blueprints for the agency. And so it really speaks to how these different kind of contests essentially between key stakeholders have played out, and sort of they settled on education, right? And I think that in large part that was driven by Palestinians demanding education. But of course, the content of education and the form that it takes continues to be a very contested question. So UNRWA, the way that it describes its education program is that it's aligned to the host state. So this is one of those examples, as I was sort of talking about earlier, about how UNRWA doesn't always sort of assume responsibility or directly make decisions. I think the education program, the way that it's set up, reflects that a little bit. So since the 50s, very early on, the curriculum that's provided or taught in UNRWA school is aligned to the host states. So effectively, you're talking about 5 or 4 different curricula, right? Depending on sort of pre-PA, post-PA Palestinian curriculum, because prior to that, it was Jordanian and Egyptian. So you're already sort of talking about a very fragmented education program. Now, UNRWA will tell you that it does teach kind of enrichment materials that are designed to provide Palestinians with a sense of their culture and their heritage and their history. That is a very contested point among Palestinians, many of whom will say, actually, no, we didn't actually receive that in our schools. The other point, I think, is that once you align an education system to the host states, you're essentially teaching the national assessments of that host state. So Palestinian children attending UNRWA schools in Lebanon are sitting for the Lebanese brevet. They are learning in English and French as a first language, sort of alongside Arabic as their first language, as language of instruction, I should say. UNRWA does not provide comprehensive secondary education, except in Lebanon it offers a limited amount. So it's also, again, it's another example of how UNRWA is sort of this system, right? Except for it's still dependent on the children being able to access education elsewhere. So, I think it speaks to how UNRWA is simultaneously kind of sort of confined and often considered its own special bubble, and yet in reality you have these connections to different systems. The other thing I think that's worth pointing out about UNRWA schools is that although UNRWA administers the schools, the teachers themselves are Palestinian. And a lot of the current debates around education that have really ramped up the last 20 years, but in particular the last 10 years, have been around this question of neutrality, right? And any education expert is going to tell you that it's just impossible for education to be neutral. And obviously, I think the same goes for aid, right? So there's this idea coming from up high, and that is constantly told to the donors, we're neutral in our education and the education that we provide. But that puts the teachers in a really, really difficult position, right? They're being asked to kind of essentially censor out a lot of really important information from what's taught to the kids. And yet they're also living, they're living the worst aspects of what it is to be a refugee in a lot of these countries. And so they're not able to be critical about the situation. They're told they have to be neutral. Previously, before neutrality, that used to be very much what the host states used to say, that they wouldn't allow the teachers to teach off of records. So you've got all of these different pressures that are existing on students, on teachers, all the way through to kind of the administration level, and whether UNRWA gets funding for its education system. So those are kind of some of the big picture points. But I do want to mention something else that I think is really important, and it goes back to what Anne said earlier about who does UNRWA cater to, right? You can also apply the same kind of logic to education. Education is much more than schooling. And so Palestinians are accessing education in many different ways, in the camps and outside of the camps, through community centers, through different civil society organizations that are really trying to plug some of these gaps. And they play a hugely, hugely important role, but they're local. They tend to be different across the different fields. And of course, the students still do deserve to be able to be taught a proper narrative of their situation. And so as much as those initiatives are incredibly important, and of course, kids are learning what they live, this question still looms really large about whether there is a way to have a more unified understanding of Palestine and what it means to be Palestinian taught in UNRWA schools.
And that brings me to the last questions very much. So we talked about several things and issues, and I was wondering if there's anything that we didn't discuss about your own work or UNRWA in general that you want to just mention as a final point.
I think the only thing that comes to mind for me is I would just expand Jo's comment about neutrality in the context of education to UNRWA's positionality as a whole. As Jo said, the whole concept of neutrality is essentially quite problematic, certainly with regard to education and arguably with regard to aid per se. In the case of UNRWA, it's often conflated neutrality with its claims to be apolitical. Both of those things are quite nebulous concepts that can have various different meanings. And in the case of UNRWA, being neutral and being apolitical has generally been interpreted to mean, being Western. And in terms of content of the archives, this is something that's talked about very explicitly, that Palestinian employees can't be promoted or can't be appointed to senior positions because they won't be able to be apolitical or they won't be able to be neutral. Obviously, that carries with it the assumption that Westerners or people from the global north, predominantly white people, are somehow, untouched by these concerns and somehow have their own positionality is irrelevant. And I think that's actually a theme that continues to this day in how UNRWA operates and in a lot of the discourse around UNRWA.
Yeah, I would just sort of double down on the neutrality point. I think it's really, it really speaks to the kind of implicit power structure in the agency, right? I mean, many critical scholars talk about, if you're neutral in the face of this type of power imbalance and inequality and inequity, then you're basically kind of maintaining a status quo. And I think UNRWA is in many ways a very extreme example of the maintenance of a status quo, and that's why the agency is very often in a kind of standoff between its different constituents, which is certainly not to the benefit of the refugees, but also means that you can simultaneously hold the view that UNRWA needs to reform, but it shouldn't shut down. Those are not mutually exclusive positions. And I think it's important to underline that view could be held by Palestinians. It could be held by others who look at UNRWA. The other kind of question on my mind about UNRWA is what its current archiving practices are, given what I saw about the knowledge of the archive and how the archive's preserved. I haven't come across staff who are aware of contemporary archiving practices, perhaps some official emails here and there, but a lot of what you get from UNRWA's central registry, at least the files that I saw related to education, are these kind of little notes, these drafts, and then people crossing things out and saying, actually, don't put that in, it's too contentious. Meeting minutes and notes that you probably wouldn't get with current email archiving. And I think that's a really important question, thinking about kind of future generations coming to understand this incredibly consequential period for the agency, which is just in a permanent existential crisis.
These were Anne Irfan, lecturer in interdisciplinary race, gender, and post-colonial studies at UCL London, and Jo Kelcey, a postdoctoral researcher at the Lebanese American University. Anne, Jo, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.